You sit frozen at the table. The silk of your gown catches lamplight, but you feel none of its warmth. Round you, laughter echoes forced, hollow. The kind that comes from men who've learned that silence costs more than compliance. The emperor moves between the couches like a priest conducting ritual, except the offering tonight isn't incense or wine. It's you. Your name, your body, your dignity all laid bare under his gaze while your husband stares into his cup, knuckles white, saying nothing. Because in this room, in this moment, power has decided that shame is entertainment and there's no law left to stop it. The woman at that table would be remembered only as one of the senator's wives, a citizen erased by spectacle, her suffering converted into a footnote in Rome's most scandalous reign. But before we explore how deep this horror went, I need to know something. Where in the world are you right now listening to this story? Drop your location in the comments. Genuinely amazes me that something this dark from ancient Rome still grabs us across continents and centuries. The city was Rome. The year, somewhere between 218 and 222 AD. The man orchestrating these banquets was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but history would strip him of that dignified name and remember him instead as Elagabalus the priest emperor, who brought a foreign god and foreign cruelty into the heart of the empire. What happened in those dining halls wasn't just excess or adolescent indulgence. It was a calculated dismantling of everything Rome's elite held sacred: honor, privacy, the sanctity of the household. And it was done with such theatrical precision that even the chronicles written by his enemies, men who had every reason to exaggerate, couldn't hide the pattern underneath the outrage. Something terrible happened at those tables. Something that made grown men complicit in their own humiliation and turned women into instruments of a power game they never agreed to play. Elagabalus wasn't born in Rome's marble corridors. He came from Emesa, a Syrian city where his family held the hereditary priesthood of the sun god Elagabal. His birth name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, and he learned spectacle before he learned politics. In Emesa, religion wasn't a Sunday obligation, it was performance, procession, the movement of sacred stones through streets, the belief that ritual could make gods walk among men. He absorbed those lessons as a boy, watching how bodies moved in ceremony, how crowds responded to symbol and gesture. It was dangerous education for someone destined to wield absolute power, because it taught him that reality could be rewritten through performance. His family led by his grandmother Julia Misa and his mother Julia. Soemias were women who understood power's machinery better than most senators. When the Severan dynasty fractured after Charicles' assassination and the brief, unstable reign of Macrinus, these women saw an opening. They had bloodline claims, Syrian legions far from Rome's scrutiny, and enough gold to make soldiers see legitimacy where there was only ambition. They placed 14-year-old Varius at the center of a claim that fused sacred priesthood with imperial inheritance, and in 218 AD, those legions proclaimed him emperor. Macrinus was defeated and killed. Rome, stunned, opened its gates to a teenage priest-king it hadn't asked for. The Senate could vote, protest, strip honors, but legions and imperial households mattered more. That reality gave Elagabalus room to attempt something no emperor had tried in living memory: to remake Roman religion entirely, to elevate his Syrian sun god above Jupiter, to turn the Palatine Hill into a stage where Eastern ritual collided with Roman tradition. He built the Elagabalium, a temple for his black sacred stone, and carried it in processions alongside Rome's ancient gods. To conservative Romans, this was sacrilege. To Cassius Dio, the senator historian who chronicled these years with barely concealed fury, it was proof of barbarism. But it wasn't theological stubbornness, it was political strategy. To elevate Elagabal was to displace Jupiter, to announce that a Syrian priest-king could reorder the divine hierarchy and, by extension, the earthly one. Within months, Rome's elite felt the shift. Their emperor wore Eastern garments, observed foreign rituals, and seemed indifferent to senatorial dignity. But the real rupture happened in private, behind the palace walls. In the banquet halls, where Roman power had always performed its delicate rituals of patronage and respect. Elagabalus turned those spaces into laboratories. The ancient sources Cassius Dio and the later Historia Augusta describe banquets that stretched across days. Meals of grotesque luxury, entertainments designed not to delight, but to dominate. Guests sat while the emperor orchestrated something darker than mere excess. He had attendants parade noble women, wives of senators, before gatherings that included their own husbands. Those husbands were expected to applaud, to laugh, to accept the emperor's commentary, as their wives were reduced to objects of imperial assessment. The sources are explicit, and they repeat the pattern too consistently to dismiss as pure fabrication. Women became props in a theater of humiliation. Their bodies used to send messages to the men who governed Rome. The insult was surgical, by degrading a senator's wife publicly. Elagabalus didn't just embarrass a household, he crushed the legitimacy of that senator's voice in the forum. Roman honor was the currency of politics. Strip it away, and you silence a man more effectively than exile or execution. For the men at those tables, each banquet was a test. Defy the emperor and risk immediate punishment. Comply and carry home an insult that would follow you like a shadow, poisoning alliances, ruining marriages, marking your family. Cassius Dio notes that the elite hated these spectacles and quietly conspired. But they were trapped, compromised by years of patronage, afraid of the Syrian soldiers who guarded the emperor, calculating whether their disgrace today might preserve their lives tomorrow. Some senators whispered treason in private rooms. Others simply stopped attending public life, withdrawing into villas where they could pretend the old order still held. The women had no such options. Roman wives of the senatorial class were citizens, but their legal agency was constrained. Chastity and reputation were their social currency, and both could be destroyed in a single evening. To be displayed at the emperor's banquet, assessed like livestock, mocked in front of your husband, that wasn't just personal trauma. It was civic injury. Roman identity hinged on the household as the basic unit of society. When an emperor transformed domestic privacy into public spectacle, he didn't just violate individuals, he destabilized the foundations of political order. And Elagabalus knew it. Whether driven by adolescent cruelty, sexual appetite, or deliberate political calculation, the sources suggest all three. He understood that these banquets were instruments of control. By forcing Rome's elite to participate in their own humiliation, he created complicity. Men who sat silent while their wives were degraded couldn't later claim moral authority. The theater had a double function: entertainment for the emperor and a trap for everyone else. But the horror went deeper. The Historia Augusta, with its taste for scandal, records that Elagabalus married Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. If true, this wasn't just transgressive, was blasphemy. Vestals were Rome's sacred guardians, women whose vows of chastity upheld the city's spiritual contract with the gods. To marry one was to violate the empire's oldest religious law. The sources claim he declared the union would produce divine children, fusing his Syrian priesthood with Rome's most ancient rites. Whether every detail is historically precise or moralized propaganda, the act reveals a ruler willing to shatter institutional boundaries for spectacle and power. Beyond marriages, the chronicles describe sexual transgressions that confounded Roman norms. Cassius Dio accuses Elagabalus of public prostitution, of reversing gender roles, of cross-dressing and demanding to be called lady instead of lord. The Historia Augusta adds lurid color, the emperor offering himself for payment, setting up degrading scenarios for men of rank. Modern historians treat these claims cautiously. Both sources were openly hostile, and their goal was to paint moral degeneracy. Yet the cumulative pattern feels real. Elagabalus rejected Roman codes of masculinity and piety in ways that threatened the entire social order. His behavior wasn't just personal eccentricity, 'twas an assault on the grammar of Roman authority, where masculinity and public power were inseparably linked. Behind the scandal, two women tried to manage the chaos. Julia Misa and Julia Soaemias had engineered his rise, and they attempted damage control once he ruled. Misa, in particular, tolerated much because the throne secured her family's power, and because removing him risked civil war. But her control had limits. The emperor's provocations alienated senators, destabilized military loyalty, and mocked Roman ceremony. He promoted freedmen and Syrian companions over traditional elites. He lavished honors on outsiders. He seemed to take pleasure in subverting hierarchy. The banquets were the public face of this broader reordering. They followed rituals Elagabalus invented. Guests entered atria filled with Eastern incense and exotic animals, sat through meals that mixed Roman customs with alien ornament. Women were paraded, sometimes forced into mock marriages or public embraces. The emperor's cruelty was theatrical, insisting on visible proof of submission. But the cruelty had a secondary effect, created guilt. Senators who participated, even under coercion, were recorded by later historians as morally stained. The theater weaponized their presence, turning witnesses into accomplices. The palace economy became a tool of domination. Elagabalus rewarded compliance with offices, money, public praise. He punished resistance with humiliation or exile. Silence had monetary value. Dissent carried immediate cost. When power rests entirely on personal favor, systems become brittle. A single violent whim can topple reputations that took generations to build, and the human consequences extended beyond political calculations. Women who were displayed suffered lifelong damage. Ancient sources hint at ruined marriages, families that hid daughters, households that sealed off entire wings where shame lived. Some families arranged hasty marriages to distant provinces. Others kept women in internal exile, erasing them from public view to preserve what remained of family honor. Roman society's moral economy meant victims often paid higher costs than perpetrators. A senator whose wife was humiliated lost clients and alliances. His voice in the forum carried less weight. And because chastity was a woman's public virtue, the victim herself bore the stain of her violation. The sources, fragmentary as they are, record suicides and madness among noble women during Elagabalus's reign. We must treat these not as rhetorical flourishes, but as political injuries made flesh violence that landed in bodies within the empire's own capital. By 221 AD, the palace climate had become unsustainable. The elite's rage, the army's restlessness, and the emperor's unpredictability formed a lethal combination. Julia Misa, ever the pragmatist, began planning contingencies. She wanted survival, even if it meant sacrificing her grandson. The conspiracy that ended Elagabalus involved the Praetorian Guard and members of his own household, people who had once laughed at his banquets but now feared their own ruin. In 222 AD, soldiers stormed the palace. They found the emperor without his Syrian retinue, without protection. They killed him quickly. Sources describe repeated stabbings, a body dragged through streets, thrown into the Tiber. The exact details vary, but the brutality is consistent. His death was spectacle, just like his life, except this time Rome wrote the script. The city that had endured his experiments chose to bury the trauma quickly. Severus Alexander, his cousin, took the throne with Mace's backing and immediately restored traditional rituals. Senatorial privileges were reasserted. The Elagabalium was dismantled. Public piety returned. But for the survivors of those banquets, restoration meant nothing like justice. The state prioritized stability over accountability. Families protected honor through silence. Daughters were married off quietly or kept hidden. No widespread prosecutions followed. Rome moved on. The chronicles that survived judged Elagabalus savagely. For Cassius Dio, his decadence proved the empire's moral decay. For the Historia Augusta, his reign became shorthand for grotesque excess, an emperor who dressed as a woman, who married a vestal, who prostituted imperial dignity. These images were designed to scandalize, and they worked. For centuries, Elagabalus became the cautionary tale about what happens when power escapes institutional restraint. But beneath the scandal lie harder truths. When multiple hostile sources independently describe a ruler weaponizing intimacy against his elite, using women's bodies as political instruments, forcing men to witness their own humiliation, historians must acknowledge reality beneath the rhetoric. The victims disappeared into silence. Some families never recovered. The personal losses, shattered marriages, daughters who never married. Households that learned survival meant burying trauma. These don't appear in official records. Rome's legal aftermath contains almost no indictments tied to the banquets. Investigating crimes inside the imperial palace meant exposing the state itself. The new emperor needed peace, not a scandal that would implicate powerful families and soldiers. So the state chose suppression. For survivors, that choice was betrayal. The memory hardened into moral fable, an emperor punished for excess, divine justice restoring order. But every fable simplifies. The deeper truth admits that Elagabalus's banquets were both political acts and personal crimes, nested within a system that enabled them. The Roman imperial structure concentrated sacred and temporal power in one person. When that person combined priestly authority with sovereign command, the result was combustible. Palace rituals replaced forum deliberations. If an emperor could reassign honor at the dinner table, he could reorder politics in subtle, permanent ways. The banquets stand as a case study in symbol-level violence power, appropriating the most intimate symbols of Roman life and weaponizing them. Marriage, chastity, hospitality, all turned into instruments of domination. That strategic use of social norms is a classic method of control. Instead of killing opponents outright, terrorize their households and networks. The psychological damage outlasts any physical regime, poisoning alliances across generations. Modern readers inherit these stories through hostile sources, yes, but also through the consistency of their horror. When chroniclers who hated Elagabalus for different reasons all describe practices that twisted social norms into tools of political control, we cannot dismiss their testimony as pure propaganda. The senators' wives displayed at those banquets. Whether every lurid detail is strictly factual or part embellished caricature, represent a class of victims across history, people whose bodies became evidence of a regime's reach, whose suffering was visible but officially erased. Rome carried on. Severus Alexander repaired civic rituals. The Julias retained influence by trading access for stability. New equilibriums formed. But the memory of those banquets didn't vanish. It entered literature as warning. It formed cautionary tales about mixing religion with unchecked authority. And it left human traces families narrowed by violence, women whose lives were never the same, a generation of elites who learned that institutions meant to protect dignity could become tools of humiliation when wielded by someone who believed himself beyond reproach. The scars weren't merely scandal or satire. They were the quiet, long aftermath in lives that never fully healed. In daughters kept from sunlight, in marriages arranged in haste and shame. In the silence that replaced laughter in certain Roman houses, a silence that lasted decades, passed down like inheritance. History records the spectacle, the teenage emperor in Eastern robes. The sacred stone carried through Roman streets, the banquets where power performed its cruelest theater. But underneath the spectacle, beneath the chronicler's outrage and the moralist's condemnation, there were women who sat at tables and learned what it meant when the boundary between public and private collapsed, when dignity became optional. When the man holding absolute power decided that shame could be entertainment and there was no law, no Senate, no God left to say otherwise. They remembered. Some wrote letters that didn't survive. Some told daughters who told granddaughters. Most carried it silently, the way trauma is carried when society decides that order matters more than justice. And Rome, the eternal city, moved on because empires always do. Because continuity demands forgetting. Because the cost of remembering might be too high for those who rule. But the banquet tables remain, in fragments of ancient text, in the shape of stories we still tell about power and its appetite. In the reminder that when authority escapes restraint, the first casualties are always those who had no voice to refuse. No power to flee, no choice but to sit in lamplight while empire decided what their bodies meant.